So, to begin with, what is trauma? So I'd like you to have a think of what comes into your head when you hear the word trauma. Because a lot of you will have worked around kind of the medical side of it. It may be things like when somebody gets into a car accident, or maybe someone has an injury. But actually what we're going to be talking about today is psychological trauma. So this is quite a good description of what trauma is. So it's a response to a discrete or prolonged circumstance which at some point is perceived by the person to be an uncontrollable serious threat to psychological or physiological integrity and which overwhelms emotional resources. So the really important part of that is overwhelms emotional resources. We're going to have a look at why something that's very traumatic for one person can actually be okay for somebody else depending on the emotional resources that they already have. So what do we mean by trauma or adversity? What we're going to be talking about. So we mean things like neglect, physical abuse, psychological abuse, domestic violence, sexual abuse, and specific events, say a natural disaster. It could be that you are living in a country that suddenly turns into a war zone, accidents, things like, weather conditions, it could be. So it's anything that happens that we don't have any control over. So trauma is a lot more complex than you might think it is. So this is a good illustration from the Scottish Psychological Trauma Training Plan that shows how complex it actually is. So you'll see that there's a big blue circle there. So the biggest blue circle is actually what trauma looks like, and other circles fit into it. So we've got single incident trauma. So that can be things like a health crisis. So you might deal with a lot of people in your work that are having quite a significant health crisis at the time. So that could be quite traumatic. And then it can be things like rape and things like assault. But that can cross over with something called complex trauma. So that's more the drip effect of trauma. So that can be big incidents, or it can be smaller incidents that combine into something bigger. So you can see that we've got things like life-threatening illnesses, domestic abuse, sexual abuse in adulthood. It can be things like torture, trafficking, and it can be being in a war zone as a civilian. And that can cross over with single incident trauma as well if you are in a war. So it can be things like military trauma if something's happened. But complex trauma can actually consist of smaller traumatic events that happen over a period of time. So it can be things like coercive control in relationships. If somebody's always telling you what to wear and what to do and not allowing you to be yourself over a period of time, that becomes a complex trauma. And you'll see that can cross over with something called ACEs. So the ACEs are the adverse childhood experiences, so we're going to be having a look at them later because they play a big part in people's susceptibility to developing trauma and mental health problems later in life. And you can see that ACEs cross over with emotional abuse, psychological abuse, and sexual abuse. So it's not quite as simple as you might think it is. So a thing to remember is that trauma is a wound, it's not an illness. So a lot of the time when you hear people talking about trauma, it gets confused with people that actually have a mental illness. But actually it isn't. It comes from the Greek word for wound. And you will see people dealing with trauma in different ways. So a lot of the time when people are engaging in behaviours, say like substance abuse, or maybe self-harm, avoidance, or maybe aggressive behaviour, they're doing it in a way to actually hide the pain of that trauma. So it's to stop them feeling the pain of that trauma. So you may see this in your jobs if you are working, say, on reception, and somebody comes in and they are very, very defensive. So it might be that they're feeling like there is a chance that you could hurt that wound. And because they feel like that you could actually hurt or open this wound again, they will get defensive first. So they will stop you doing that. So a lot of the things that you will see will be a way that people actually deal with the trauma and not the trauma itself. So we can think of trauma as the 3 E's. I just wonder, has anybody put their hands up if they've heard of the 3 E's of trauma before? No? Well, that's good. So trauma as an event. So a lot of the time when we think about trauma, we think of it as the event itself. So an event happens to somebody, it's really traumatic, and that is the trauma. When in reality, the event itself is not the trauma. It's also the experience and the effect. So what happens is something that happens to one person can be experienced in a very different way from the same thing happening to somebody else. So what that does is it's the way you experience that event that causes the effect. So the effect is how the brain ends up being rewired. So it's almost like different neural pathways open in the brain and they become the dominant pathway. And everything goes through that pathway. So if you think of it a little bit like putting on tinted glasses. So tinted trauma glasses, where everything that you then see is filtered through those glasses. So it actually changes the way that people see the world. The good thing about the 3 E's is that you can actually change the effect. So if trauma was the event itself, you can't go back in time and you can't change that event. That event is always going to have happened. That event is always going to have been there. But what you can do is you can change the effect of the experience. So you can reframe it and you can work with it and you can actually rewire your brain. So just because traumatic experiences have happened to someone, it doesn't mean that they're going to be traumatized forever. Given the right situations, it can be reversed. But it's the understanding that it's about putting people in those situations. And what we're going to be looking at later with the trauma-informed practice is how we can not re-traumatize people and how we can almost help towards them getting to a point where they can reverse the effect. Because what tends to happen is when people are really quite traumatized, they end up with like trauma on top of trauma. So we said about the way that people deal with things. So things like if they're using substances to deal with that trauma, using substances in itself is quite a traumatic thing to do. So not only have they got the trauma that was there originally, they've now got more trauma on top of that. So it's about helping people find safety and get into a situation where they can start really reversing the effect of that event experience. And this is why we're all affected by traumatic events in different ways. And it's really about understanding that we've all had trauma. You know, trauma is actually part of life. We all have things that we do feel that our sort of reserve, our kind of emotional reserve sort of overflows with things. But actually, it's different depending on the situation. And a really good example of this is COVID. So if you have a look at this picture here, in the same storm but not in the same boat. So I'd like you to think back to lockdown. I know this can be quite traumatic for some people because it was a really quite traumatic thing for quite a lot of people. But if we look at that picture of the cruise ship there and the little man in the rowing boat, I think that kind of sums up what happened in COVID, because we were all in the same, we all were having the same, it was all the same event for everybody, but the actual experience of that event was very different depending on where you were in your life. So it would be very different for somebody that was comfortably middle class, living in quite a large house, maybe with children and a husband, and a supportive family around them, than it would have been for maybe somebody that was homeless, or if somebody was maybe living in a bedsit.
Or the elderly.
Oh,
yeah. No, just saying that quite a lot of times the elderly were on their own and isolated, or you might have lived on your own and be isolated and not had much community around yourself. You know, my experience was reasonable. I'd got a family at home. I could work from home. I didn't have those additional stresses of having to get out of the house, if that makes sense. So I felt reasonably safe. I could get my shopping online and I could use the technology that we had around us. But if we're not in that situation, I suppose in that case I wasn't quite on a luxury liner, but I wasn't in the rowing boat on my own. But one of the things we would think it'd be helpful to have a think about is if you could turn to the person next to you. What's the question? I think go on, I'll pass it back to Dee. We've got a question to ask.
Yeah, so what we're going to do is we're just going to have a little bit of an exercise now, because we do like to do these sessions a bit more interactively, but because it's such a big group, it's a bit more difficult. So what we're going to do is we're going to give you 5 minutes to just have a chat to the person next to you about what your experience was like in lockdown, what helped your situation and what didn't help your situation.
Does that sound okay?
Yeah, so I'll let you know when 5 minutes is up. Right, everybody. So, I was wondering, is anyone feeling particularly brave that would like to share what they talked about with us? I think that's a no. Or you can put it on Slido if you'd like. That's another option. I'd just like to say something. The reason I'm sat down and I'm not walking around the room is that a few of you may have seen me in the last few weeks popping up in GP receptionists areas. I haven't been very well, so that's why I'm not kind of moving around as much as I normally would if I'd be doing something like this. So apologies for just kind of sitting here. But you wouldn't want to hear me going, ow, every time I moved wrong. Right, so the next we're going to have a look at the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, which was a study that was really, really eye-opening, that showed how adverse childhood experiences in life could actually follow through, in childhood could follow through into adulthood and actually follow that person throughout their lives. Now, hands up, anyone who's heard of the ACEs study before? It's good. Good, we've got a few people. Excellent. So the original ACE study was conducted in America from 1995 to 1997. 2 waves of data were collected and more than 17,000 people were involved. So what the study entailed looking at a large group of people who were actually middle-aged at this point. Yeah. Actually, one of the things that they said about the ACEs study is actually the majority of people were white and middle class. So
Not like me.
no. Which actually the results showed what they did, but actually it would have been better to use a more diverse group. But what the results did show is that this is what they actually looked at. So they divided adverse childhood experiences into certain areas. So they had abuse, that would be physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse. They had neglect, so that would be physical neglect or emotional neglect. So they had also household dysfunction, so that would be things like parents with mental health problems. It would be parents that maybe were incarcerated, either one or more parents. It could be violence in the household. It could be substance abuse in that household, or it could be divorce, separation or death. So these were the categories that they used. And they did the study again, so they were so amazed by the results of this study that they repeated the study in 2014 in the UK. And they found out that 47% of people had experienced at least one ACE, with 9% of the population having more than 4. So we're talking about a really large percentage of the population here having adverse childhood experiences. And what these adverse childhood experiences were actually linked to were the behaviour of the people through their lives. So it was seen that people that had them had a lack of physical activity, you were much more likely to smoke, you were much more likely to have alcohol use problems, to have drug use problems, and you were much more likely to be unemployed or have missed work. What it also showed is it showed physical and mental health issues as well associated. So you'd see more people with severe obesity, so you'd see more people with diabetes. You'd see more incidences of depression, more suicide attempts, more sexually transmitted diseases, more heart disease, more cancer, more stroke, more COPD and more broken bones. So all of these conditions that you wouldn't normally associate with developmental trauma, they were seeing more regularly in people that had it. So if you look at things, just for an example, picking out things like broken bones. So you wouldn't expect there to be a connection between the two. But then if people have got significant trauma in the past, they're much more likely to actually engage in more risky behaviour. So you're much more likely to have, the chance of getting things like broken bones. The same with stroke, if people are, maybe not looking after themselves, and the things like cancer. Now we're going to have a look at what adverse childhood experiences actually do to the brain, which could go towards explaining things like cancer and things like heart disease. Because what happens when somebody has developmental trauma in their childhood is that you'll see their brain adapts. So you can see on the left here that there is typical development. So that is what you'd expect to see in children growing up in a household where there wasn't disruption. So you'll see that the biggest part of the brain, the most used part of the brain, is cognition. So cognition is things like making decisions, so making choices. And then you've got social and emotional, having friends, and regulating emotions. Then you've got regulation, and at the very bottom you've got survival. Because if somebody grows up in a stable environment, they're not going to spend a lot of time worrying about survival. But what happens in developmental trauma is that the brain almost flips upside down. So what happens is survival becomes the most dominant part of that person's brain, that child's brain. So they will be constantly looking for threats. And when, that can affect things like studying, it can affect home life, it can affect friendships, and you'll see everything else gets pushed down. So regulation gets smaller, social, emotional gets smaller, and the very smallest part is cognition. So that decision making. So weighing things up, making healthy choices, that gets smaller when someone is in survival mode. So you can think of survival mode like in fight or flight. So the brain goes into fight or flight when it feels like it's in danger. And we've all had it, we've all been there, we've all had a shock, and we've gone into fight or flight, and we know how bad it feels. And in that state, you can't make good choices. But what happens when somebody's got developmental trauma is they always exist in that state, because they've had to survive. If you're in a forest and a bear jumps out at you, you're going to go into fight or flight, you're going to run away, and it's going to be really, really helpful. But if you're going home every night to that bear and you can't run away, you're going to live in that state. And that's where the problems come from. Because there are two sides of the autonomic nervous system. When you look at fight or flight, there's rest and digest and fight and flight. And if you spend all your time in fight or flight, you're not going to go into rest and digest, and that's the area where your cells start repairing itself. That's where, things like health conditions can really come into it. And you'll see if somebody has had chronic stress over a long period of time, they're much more likely to develop health conditions.
Can I share my experience of this slide?
Yeah.
So I just want to... This was when I first saw this slide, I've done lots of learning about myself and read lots of, many hundreds of books about how to improve my personal development, my self-awareness, my confidence. But it wasn't until I met Dee and saw this slide that it really helped me understand where I'd been living from such a long time in the survival mode. And it really helped me understand that whilst I knew it intellectually, actually it was really weird. I've seen lots of triangle slides in my time of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but it wasn't until I saw this and it really saw the expanse of the survival that I realised that whilst I had a lot of safety in my life and a lot of love in my life, knowing that some of the decisions I'd made throughout my childhood and my adulthood and the relationships that I'd built and how I interacted and how I sparked into sort of defence mode in certain situations, this sort of really helped me understand and give me some self-compassion for me and for others. Because although I could, I've learned, to be mindful and to meditate and to do good things for myself. It's helped me understand that at 56, no wonder it's taken me such a long time to actually be able to bring myself down faster. And even I've just been on holiday and it took me several days just to settle, and I still have to think about what is it that I want to do on my holiday, or what is it that I want to do in my life that I'm not pleasing other people or trying to stay safe. Does that make sense? And I think it's really interesting that we don't come into the doctor's surgery when we're in a good place. So, whether you had a lot of safety in your life and a lot of positiveness around you and a lot of, or a lot less trauma than others, there's still an element of you coming in a possibly, survival state rather than a thrive state. Does that make sense? I just thought it'd be, this slide means such a lot to me, and I just think it's really helpful to say that although I've not gone through the route of using substances to manage myself, I do realise there's a lot of patterns in my life that haven't been helpful, fed from this state of trauma. So I'll just pass back to Dee. Thank you.
You love that slide.
I do love that slide, sorry.
I always know when this slide comes up that I'll lose the room to Nicola for a bit. Anyway, so as you can see on that, when people live in survival mode for a lot of the time, it sets them up for something called latent vulnerability, which is latent vulnerability to mental health or health crises later in life. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's a definite, it doesn't mean that that's going to happen, it just makes people more vulnerable to that later in life. So the next part, we're going to have a look at what the ACE study actually showed, and I find these quite shocking. The first time I saw this, I was really, really surprised. So I'm just going to give the mic over to Nick again, who's just going to read out the results of that.
Yeah, so I've not switched it off. Yeah, so as you can see it on there, but I'll just read it out anyway. Compared with people with no ACEs, those with 4+ ACEs are 4 times more likely to be a high-risk drinker, 6 times more likely to have had or caused unintended teenage pregnancy, 6 times more likely to smoke e-cigarettes or tobacco, and 6 times more likely to have had sex under the age of 16 years of age. 11, and then it goes up, 11 times more likely to have smoked cannabis, 14 times more likely to have been a victim of violence over the last 12 months, and 15 times more likely to have committed violence against another person in the last 12 months, and 16 times more likely to have used crack cocaine or heroin, and 20 times more likely to have been incarcerated at any point in their lifetime. So, for me, this sort of helps me again give more understanding and awareness to the things that have happened things that could have happened in other people's lives and how it affects their choices that they make now. It's not until you see those figures rise that you realise how much trauma can affect individuals in their lifetime. And these are the people that, these are some of the people that may be coming into your surgeries.
So what's really struck me about these results is this idea of lifestyle choice. especially when we're talking about people who have things like substance abuse issues, or maybe, you know, some people even talk about people on long-term sick like that.
Yeah.
It's like this kind of blaming that people get into because they see people making choices and they don't understand it. When actually, when you look at the result of this score, it's really quite surprising how people's lives are really influenced by what happened in childhood when they didn't have a choice over things. They couldn't control that. And when you look at the survival brain and understand that it's very difficult to weigh things up when you're in survival mode, it makes it much easier to kind of understand why people make the choices that they do. And actually the choices get smaller.
And they're not made from a place of safety and an informed place.
Yeah.
And that's the challenge, I think, for a lot of people, that it's the safety and it's the safety and the information where that they're gathered from. I've had lots of conversations with myself and my partner about lifestyle choices, and I must admit it was a phrase that I did used to use about, well, it's somebody's lifestyle choice, but it's not until you actually look underneath the surface and start to ask yourself the questions, not everybody starts from the same place or similar places, or not everybody is given an equal start in life, and if they often have to gather those resources to feel that they've got the same or similar choice options to other people. So I still do catch myself saying, oh, it's a lifestyle choice, but hopefully it stays in my brain rather than coming out of my mouth because of the information that I've gathered over the last few years.
Thank you. I think as well as somebody that maybe made some really not great lifestyle choices myself in my sort of late teens and 20s, seeing these results actually, it made me feel better, to be honest, because I blamed myself a lot for what happened to me. You know, I still do. I look back and I sometimes just think, wow, how could I have thought that was a good idea? But actually, when you really look at the ACEs and really look at sort of childhood trauma and how that really impacted me as a person, you know, I had the problem with, definitely had the problem that we talked about living in survival and being hypervigilant. Really struggled to learn in school, and because I was seen as somebody that wasn't teachable, I got put into one of the lower classes and they didn't even try. Left school with no GCSEs, which made it very difficult to get a job. So it kind of accumulates, you know, all of these things so not only does it have an effect on all of this, but it makes it much more difficult to sort of bounce back. So as we were saying before, everybody has traumatic events happening in their lives, but some people have the resources on tap to kind of bounce back. But when there is latent vulnerability there, traumatic events now can have a much bigger impact on people's lives. And here's some more statistics around that. So if we actually look at suicide attempts compared to the ACE score, you'll see them gradually going up, and then going up quite dramatically when you get over 4 ACEs. And then IV drug use. So when somebody's over 6 ACEs, the increase is massive. So I don't think that's a coincidence. You know, it really does go down to making choices and not having the ability to make those choices because of past traumas. When you start having a look at the link between ACEs and severe multiple disadvantages, it's really heavily linked. So 85% of people with severe multiple disadvantage had traumatic experiences in childhood. And what we mean by severe multiple disadvantages is the overlap between substance use, mental health, homelessness and crime. 85%. So it doesn't just lead to sort of one thing, it leads to multiple things. And once you are sort of classed as someone with severe multiple disadvantages, it's really difficult to get out of that. Because what happens is, and next we're going to talk about something called re-traumatisation, which happens a lot in different services. So what happens with people who are traumatised, if they don't get the place to recover? So as I was saying about my experience with leaving school without English and maths GCSEs, made it very difficult to get a job. And then you do things like you interact with the job centre, who don't particularly treat you very well, and then you interact with other services. Then if you develop mental health problems, you then have to interact with services there. And what happens is it becomes trauma on top of trauma. Because if you've been in a situation in your younger years where you felt out of control, you know, maybe you were in a household where you felt nobody heard you, and you were always terrified of things being taken away, to then throw that person older into like the benefit system, or into trying to get a job where nobody actually wants to get them because maybe they've got a criminal record, it's trauma on top of trauma. You know, it's taking that person's power away. And you'll see this a lot, actually, I think, in the people that come into the surgeries. They'll have been re-traumatised so many times that they go in with their guards up. You know, and when you're having that conversation with somebody and they're not listening, and you're getting frustrated because that person's not listening, it might be that they don't have the capacity to listen. It might be that they're in the survival mode, and actually because they're in that mode of survival, they can't actually hear you. And they're scared because they want the treatment and they're not, and they feel like you're blocking them getting it.
We know you're not, by the way.
We know that you're not. We know that you're not. But actually, it may be that you're dealing with people that feel that it's already happened before it has, because they've been into other services and they've had similar experiences, so they're almost expecting it to happen, and it becomes kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. I mean, as somebody who went through, who had my own experience of what it's like actually kind of accessing services as someone with substance use issues, it's not great. You know, I'm going to be talking a little bit later about my lived experience of it, but in all honesty, you start to expect the worst, and because you expect the worst, you then kind of get the defences up first, and you feel like you'll get that person before they get you, and it's not good for anyone involved. And actually, it's been a really different experience for me accessing services now than it used to be. But I will talk to you a little bit more about that later, because we've got a video next, which kind of talks about what I've talked about and then introduces you in a really nice way to the benefits of trauma-informed practice.
You did test this earlier, so hopefully.
Yeah. Keep your fingers crossed.
Whenever Mum went away, he would come into my room. He said I made him do it, and that it meant he loved me. It always made me feel powerless, ashamed.
I never knew when an argument would turn into a fight. I was always scared, always on edge, always had to be ready to defend myself.
My late husband was very controlling, always put me down, told me what to wear or cook. He'd get angry if I didn't do things right. I had no choice or control. It made me feel useless. I had no confidence in the end.
So I zoned out, pretended it wasn't happening. It's so difficult to trust people now. I just freeze and float away in my head when I feel powerless.
Now I just get angry a lot, feel like I want to fight. Sometimes I worry I'm just like him.
I find it difficult to do things myself, and I get really nervous when I have to talk to new people. I avoid them when I can.
What we went through was traumatic because we were harmed physically, emotionally, and felt like we were in real danger.
Traumatic experiences can be things that happen once, a serious accident or assault.
Or it can be where traumatic things keep happening, like physical or sexual childhood abuse, or domestic abuse, or relationships where you can't be yourself, where you're put down or bullied.
It can make you feel powerless, trapped, or betrayed. The sense of confusion, shame, or fear can be overwhelming, especially if there is no one you feel able to tell. Even after it's over, it's harder to get on with life and feel safe.
Trauma is more common than most people think. Almost 1 in 5 adults has experienced physical or sexual abuse in their childhood.
And more than a quarter of all women have experienced domestic abuse.
Some people recover after traumatic events. Some people aren't affected as much. Having good, safe, supportive relationships with other people can really help. But lots of people continue to be affected by trauma, sometimes long after it happened.
For most of us, traumatic or adverse childhood experiences like these affect our body's response to stress, affecting our physical health as well as our mental health. The impact of trauma can also make it harder for us to learn and to realise our full potential.
One of the most worrying things about the experience of trauma is that it can make us avoid people and places, even if they are there to help, like doctors, teachers, social workers, carers, colleges.
Councils, community centres, employers, advisors. Because most trauma experiences happen in relationships with other people, we can find it difficult to trust people or feel safe. And sometimes the way we react to help ourselves feel safe pushes people away and makes it even harder to get the help we need.
It's like our brains learn survival tricks to get us through the trauma at the time, like priming us for danger.
Making us run away.
Shutting down when we feel upset.
It might look like we have a short fuse, like we're unfriendly, or we're just a bit absent.
Anything, however small, that reminds us of that trauma can set off our own unique trauma response to protect ourselves, making us avoid the people and places that we need the most, like you. But there are things you can do to help me trust you enough so I feel safe and I don't shut down or avoid you. You can offer me a different relationship that doesn't remind me of the one I had when I was a kid. One where I feel safe, I feel empowered, and I have choice and control over what happens to me. One where we work together and I can trust you. This is called being trauma-informed in the way you work.
Being trauma-informed means thinking about what will make me feel safe. It might mean offering me choice over the sex of the person offering me care or support, especially if it involves intimate care or examinations.
Unfortunately, your usual care worker Heather's off sick. We'll be sending someone else instead. Do you have any preferences about who comes instead?
Well, I'd feel more comfortable with someone I've met before. Most importantly, I'd like a woman.
Well, how about June? She's worked with us for 3 years. If there's anything you'd like her to do that Heather normally does, just ask.
Trauma-informed means empowering me to have control and take an active role in what happens to me.
We know some people don't like coming to the dentist, so is there anything that you're worried about or scared of? I can tell you each step I'm doing, so there are no surprises if you'd like. If you need me to stop, how will you tell me?
Trauma-informed means helping me to trust you by being clear about what will happen, doing what you say you will do when you said you would do it.
Unfortunately, our advisors are running about 30 minutes late, I'm so sorry about that. Are you able to stay, or can we make another appointment for you?
Many of us at work will have had our own experiences of trauma in our own lives, or we might witness or hear about it in the course of our work. So the same principles apply to all of us. We all need to take care of ourselves by making sure we're safe and connected to the people and activities that matter to us. Can you think of anyone you've met or worked with recently that a trauma-informed approach would have made a difference to? Are there any trauma-informed changes you might make that could make a difference?
So if you offer me safety and choice, if you collaborate with me and empower me and help me trust you, then you will help me work with you. Even if I only meet you once, even briefly, you can give me a different kind of relationship. One where I feel valued and valuable, connected and safe.
And when that happens over and over again with everyone that I meet, I can learn that it's safe to make connections with people.
It is those connections that we all need to access life chances and reach our full potential.
Right, so that was quite a hard-hitting video. So what we're going to do now is we're actually going to have a 20-minute break. So you can go and make yourself a cup of coffee, chill out a little bit, and then we'll see you at 10 to. So if you come back at 10 to 3.
Okay.
Thank you.